Consideration of Covert Action Matters by President Kennedy's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Briefing of President by DCI, June 28, 1961. References to covert actions. Board reports to President. CIA report on USSR and Communist China expenditures. Briefing of Board panel by Secretary. Special Group, May 11, 1962. Chairman's discussions of covert action matters with DCI, May 1962. Discussion with General Taylor, June 29, 1962. Briefing of Board panel, July 20, 1962. CIA briefing of Board panel, November 1, 1962. Board discussion with General Taylor, Chairman, JCS, January 26, 1963. CIA briefing of Board panel, April 15, 1963. Briefing of Board panel, September 6, 1963. State Department briefing of Board panel, September 6, 1963. Discussions with McGeorge Bundy, September 23, 1963. Excerpts, Minutes of Board Meetings, 1961 to 1963. CIA briefing of the Board's Covert Action Panel, April 15, 1963. On April 15, 1963, Mr. Cord Meyer of CIA met at the Board's offices with the Board's panel on covert actions, Messrs. Murphy and Gray, Mr. J. Patrick Coyne, and Mr. A. Russell Ash. Mr. Meyer briefed the Board panel on the major covert action programs of the CIA, with the exception of programs relating to Cuba, a subject scheduled to be covered in a briefing of the full Board on April 23, 1963. Mr. Meyer described the political action programs which had been pursued with respect to Chile. In his briefing, Mr. Meyer also covered programs with respect to Argentina, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Brazil, Venezuela, Peru, Japan, Congo, Kenya, Italy, and France. As a follow-up to the above-mentioned briefing of the Board panel on covert actions, Mr. Gray and Mr. Coyne were given a further briefing on the subject at CIA headquarters on May 16, 1963, with a number of CIA representatives participating from the DDP staff. This briefing included considerable information with respect to the nature and level of Soviet espionage activities being conducted in various areas of the world. Briefing of Board's Covert Action Panel by State Department representatives, September 6, 1963. Mr. Murphy, Dr. Langer, and Mr. Coyne met with Mr. Thomas Hughes, Director of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research of the Department of State on September 6, 1963, for a discussion of several matters in the intelligence area. With regard to covert action matters, Mr. Hughes said that his bureau in the Department of State is responsible for coordinating all NSC 5412 by 2 matters throughout the department. Mr. Hughes felt that this job was being performed satisfactorily, but he regretted that the State Department played a relatively minor role in special group activities. Mr. Hughes also expressed concern about the DCI's failure to provide sufficient time in advance of special group meetings for the coordination of covert action proposals which are to be discussed at the meetings and concerning which the Department of State has an interest. In a discussion with Undersecretary Alexis Johnson, the panel was told that in Mr. Johnson's opinion, CIA is now coordinating its covert action programs with the appropriate elements of the Department of State. He did comment, however, that new programs are submitted to the department at the very last moment because the Director of Central Intelligence wishes to sign off personally on new covert action proposals before they are submitted to the Department of State or to the special group. Secretary Johnson, in reply to a question posed by the panel, said that the special group does not follow the general practice of reviewing periodically the status of implementation of covert action programs approved by the special group, and he thought it would be a good idea to have such reviews made, possibly by the Bureau of Intelligence and Research in the State Department. CIA briefing of the Board's Covert Action Panel, September 6, 1963. The Board's Covert Action Panel met on September 6, 1963. Present were Mr. Robert Murphy, Chairman, Mr. Gordon Gray, Dr. William Langer, and Messrs. Coyne and Ash. During the course of the meeting, the Board panel was briefed by Mr. Richard Helms, Deputy DCI/Plans, CIA, and CIA representatives Cord Meyer and Desmond Fitzgerald. The briefings were on the subject of covert action programs with respect to British Guiana, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Vietnam, Bolivia, Brazil, and Cuba. Excerpts from minutes of President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board meetings with respect to covert actions matters. Meeting of May 15, 1961. The then DCI, Mr. Allen Dulles, joined in a discussion of the highlights of CIA's activities. In the covert actions field, Mr. Dulles suggested that the board look into the future relationship of CIA to paramilitary activities, Mr. Dulles being of the opinion that paramilitary operations should not be conducted by the CIA. Mr. Dulles thought that the board should look at such CIA activities as the use of proprietary organizations, including Radio Free Europe, RAE, the Afro-American Institute, and various labor and youth groups. Mr. Dulles was asked whether a removal of paramilitary activities from CIA responsibility would permit a significant cut in the CIA budget and personnel figures, and Mr. Dulles replied that such was not the case because of the extensive activities being carried on by the International Organizations Division of the DDP, and because of the many proprietary activities in which CIA is involved. Darlan said that he was both shocked and indignant to learn that Radio Free Europe is a proprietary organization of the CIA. Mr. Clifford said that he had been on the board of directors of RFE for the past 3 years, and this was the first time he had known it was connected with CIA. Mr. Dulles was asked what was the extent of the knowledge of American businessmen concerning the RFE-CIA connection, and Mr. Dulles replied that certain American businessmen are aware of the connection, but not the man in the street who makes dollar contributions to the tune of $3 million a year. Board Chairman Killian appointed himself and Messrs. Murphy, Langer, and Taylor to serve on a panel of the board to study the extent to which the government should be involved in political, psychological, propaganda, and paramilitary activities, and the policy which should be pursued by the U.S. government in these matters. President Kennedy joined the board meeting, and when the discussion turned to a recommendation of the prior board, the President referred to a recommendation that covert action programs of the CIA may not have been worth the risk nor worth the great expenditure of manpower and money. That CIA concentration on such activities had tended to detract substantially from the execution of its primary intelligence gathering mission, and that there should be a total reassessment of U.S. covert action policies and programs. The President indicated that except for Laos and Cuba, he did not have extensive knowledge of other covert operations being conducted by the CIA. He said that he had the feeling that someone in the White House should be constantly in touch with and on top of covert operations, and he observed that the Congress believes that someone in the White House is keeping close watch on such matters. After a discussion of the Indonesia situation, President Kennedy thought that the Cuba fiasco was Indonesia all over again, and he wondered if the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense should not be better informed regarding these matters. The President also expressed concern over the recent development in Singapore, which involved some bungled efforts on the part of CIA to penetrate the Singapore police. Following expressions of views by General Taylor, McGeorge Bundy, and Mr. Gray, the President agreed that in addition to the need for staffing of NSC 5412 by 2 matters, the President needed to be kept informed with respect to these programs on a continuing basis. Meeting of May 26, 1961. In this second meeting of the PFIAB, the discussion included a statement by General Doolittle that proposed reorganization steps with respect to the CIA would involve the question of the interference of covert operations with intelligence collection. General Doolittle had found, he said, that the covert operations dog is wagging the intelligence tail, when in fact this should be reversed. General Doolittle added that a great number of people in the CIA are more interested in the political, psychological, propaganda, and paramilitary than they are in the dry, difficult but important task of collecting, interpreting, and distributing intelligence, a matter which General Doolittle thought could be corrected by a change of emphasis and by a change in organization. At one point in the meeting, when the DCI, Mr. Allen Dulles, was present, that official said that with respect to organizational matters, he favored transferring paramilitary activities to the Defense Department. He opposed the separation of other covert action activities from foreign intelligence activities, and he was opposed to separating the post of DCI from that of head of the CIA. Meeting of June 7, 1961. Upon the completion of its third meeting on June 7, 1961, the board met that evening with President Kennedy, the Attorney General, and Mr. McGeorge Bundy were also present. in connection with a statement by the president that he was receiving inadequate information concerning developments in a number of countries. Board Chairman Killian said that it was the general consensus of the board that the CIA was placing too much stress upon covert action activities, with insufficient emphasis placed upon the acquisition of intelligence. Later in the discussion, Mr. McGeorge Bundy said that in line with the president's wishes, a list was being prepared of all programs involving covert support to political parties abroad and support to individuals associated with political parties, with a view to assessing the direction and value of those programs. Mr. Bundy noting that certain of these problem areas, which had been referred to by Ambassador Galbraith in connection with covert actions in India, had been recently reviewed by the Special NSC 5412 by 2 Group. Board Chairman Killian informed the president that in the board's view the responsibilities of the U.S. ambassadors should be clarified to make sure that each ambassador is cognizant of the intelligence collection and covert action activities which are conducted in or from his country of assignment, and for the purpose of assuring that such activities are consistent with the overall national security policies of the president. Later on in the discussion, the president commented on a suggestion that he not be publicly identified with clandestine or covert action activities, saying that he thought this raised a question about the desirability of setting up on the White House staff a special assistant for intelligence. Mr. Bundy thought it would be all right to establish such a position, provided that the special assistant was himself not publicly identified with any responsibility for covert operations. Meeting of June 30th to July 2nd, 1961. A portion of this board meeting was attended by Mr. McGeorge Bundy, who, at one point, read to the board the letter from President Kennedy appointing General Taylor as military representative. Mr. Bundy emphasized that General Taylor's appointment was not exclusively military in character, for the president desired that General Taylor counsel him with respect to certain intelligence matters, and in the field of covert action activities, the president wished to look to General Taylor for special guidance, and therefore the president had appointed General Taylor to serve as chairman of the Special 5412 by 2 Group. Mr. Bundy mentioned that recently a 2-hour briefing had been provided to the president, Mr. Bundy, General Taylor, and Mr. Coyne by Messrs. Dulles and Bissell concerning major covert action programs currently being carried out by the agency. At another point in the meeting, the board heard comments from Mr. Roger Hilsman, Director of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the Department of State. Among other things, Mr. Hilsman felt that the U.S. government was not making full use of covert action operations in providing assistance to foreign political parties. He thought that such operations were important and could be helpful if done skillfully. Mr. Hilsman expressed criticism of the fact that the Department of State was brought into CIA's planning in the NSC 5412 by 2 area only at the last moment, which made it difficult for the State Department to take a position without knowledge of the extent and nature of the CIA resources that would be involved. Mr. Hilsman went on to say that he favored reorganizing the CIA along the general lines of the British intelligence system. He would place clandestine collection and covert political action operations under the Department of State, and he would require that the State Department exercise policy control over all aspects of intelligence, including political, psychological, propaganda, paramilitary, and related covert activities. Meeting of July 18, 1961. In the course of this meeting, Mr. Bissell of CIA was invited to discuss with board members his views on possible reorganization steps that might be taken with respect to the CIA. At one point in the discussion, Mr. Bissell volunteered the suggestion that perhaps a step might be taken by the president to obtain a better public understanding and acceptance of the CIA's responsibilities. Mr. Bissell suggested that perhaps the president could make an appropriate announcement which would include recognition of the existence of the body known as the Special NSC 5412 by 2 Group, telling of the group's duties and who composed it, without giving the public any information on the actual nature of the covert operations performed by the CIA. Meeting of October 16 to 17, 1961. During the board meeting of October 16 to 17, 1961, the Director of Central Intelligence, Mr. Allen Dulles, commented that the principle of compartmentation was being violated by CIA in its dealings with the PFIAB because of the CIA's effort to meet the convenience of the board. Mr. Dulles said that one example of this was the action taken by CIA in furnishing the detailed compilation concerning the proprietary and other covert organizations with which CIA has dealings in its covert action programs. Mr. Coyne observed that material received by the board from the CIA and more sensitive information received from other U.S. intelligence agencies is given a greater degree of security in the board than in the CIA itself. For use at this board meeting, a 17-page summary had been prepared in the board's offices based on an undated document from CIA marked Top Secret Eyes Only Extremely Sensitive, containing a listing and brief description of all CIA covert organizations and proprietary activities, including references to the Asia Foundation, Radio Free Europe, Institute of National Labor Research, World Confederation of Organizations of the Teaching Profession, U.S. National Student Association, and many others. Mr. Dulles told the board that the CIA can play a helpful but relatively modest role with regard to the Laos and South Vietnam problems, and he thought it would be well if the board would suggest ways in which the CIA could more effectively utilize its resources in meeting such problems. The DCI observed that the CIA must do more in all covert action fields because the U.S. faces the most formidable covert action apparatus ever seen. He said that this apparatus is the most effective one ever established, and the U.S. has nothing like it. During an executive session on October 17, 1961, Board Chairman Killian suggested that board members give serious thought to the CIA's use of foundations as covers for operations, and he cited the Asia Foundation and the International Commission of Jurists as examples. Dr. Killian felt that there is danger that the entire foundation systems in the U.S. would be discredited if there were a disclosure of CIA's connection with them. It was Dr. Killian's view that the CIA should not place clandestine cover on any student, and he felt that it would be very serious should it become known that the National Student Federation, for example, was being financed by CIA as a cover organization. Dr. Langer expressed agreement with this, but felt that CIA would be justified in using foundations as a cover in combating communist influence in such activities as labor unions. Mr. Clifford thought that perhaps Dr. Killian's concern with regard to educational foundations might be possibly met by the use of cut-off organizations between the CIA and the foundations as a means of concealing their financial support to the foundations. Mr. Coyne reminded board members of the board's recommendation of last July that all existing covert action programs be reviewed by the special NSC 5412 by 2 group. In answer to a question from General Doolittle, Mr. Coyne told the board that written summaries which had been furnished to the board members concerning CIA's covert organization activities were being given special security handling and strict accountability. The board meeting was joined by CIA representatives Lyman Kirkpatrick, Richard Helms, Cord Meyer, and others for an oral presentation and discussion with respect to CIA covert organizations, including commercial organizations and such. Foundation supported student groups as the National Students Federation. After Mr. Helms had discussed the use of non-official covers for individual CIA personnel, Mr. Cord Meyer described the CIA's use of foundations and proprietary organizations. Mr. Meyer then described such large-scale CIA covert organizations as Radio Free Europe, where the objective is propaganda, and other organizations which CIA directs against Soviet front organizations, where the effort is to exert influence and at the same time do genuine work for the benefit of the covert organization and its program. As in the case of the Asia Foundation and the Afro-American Institute, which are based in the U.S. and whose activities are subject to CIA influence in the form of money and a degree of policy direction. In answer to questions from board members as to the danger of a disclosure of CIA's relationship to these various foundations, Mr. Meyer said that there was no grave danger of a cultural U2 incident, and the risk of a disclosure by a defector, for example, was less than the risk of a U.S. news story or a disclosure resulting from gossip among members of the U.S. Foundation community. Mr. Meyer considered it inevitable that the Asian mentality would suspect that there is U.S. government influence in all U.S.-based foundations. Chinese communist propaganda continually charges that U.S. government or Wall Street control exists in these foundations, even in the Ford Foundation, where this is not the case. Nevertheless, the cover foundations, which are in fact influenced by CIA, continue to do legitimate work as, for example, in the case of a labor training school supported by the Asia Foundation in Pakistan, and in the case of a teacher training grant at the University of Rangoon, and in the case of the National Students Federation. Mr. Meyer pointed out that CIA financial support is normally funneled through a variety of channels, and CIA money goes to the National Educational Association through a cutout arrangement. Mr. Meyer expressed the opinion that CIA has budgetary control over the use of monies contributed to international student groups would deter any effort to impose foreign influence upon U.S. student organizations. Mr. Meyer informed the board that CIA cover organization activities are approved by the CIA Project Review Committee, with the State Department being made knowledgeable. Mr. Helms stated that since January 20, 1961, there had been no review of such activities by the NSC nor by the Special NSC 5412 by 2 group. Next, the board was briefed by CIA Representatives Amory, Breitweiser, and others concerning CIA paramilitary involvement in Laos and South Vietnam. In the latter country, this activity included ground reconnaissance teams and intelligence teams, and a recent requirement on CIA to harass Soviet airdrops of supplies in the Southeast Asia area. When the board met with President Kennedy on the afternoon of October 17, 1961, the chairman read to the president the text of the board's report on paramilitary activities, and he mentioned to the president the highlights of presentations which the board had heard earlier that day concerning developments in Laos. The president directed Mr. Coyne to discuss this subject with Mr. McGeorge Bundy, with a view to a review of paramilitary activities in Laos to be conducted by the Special NSC 5412 by 2 group. This was discussed by Mr. Coyne with Mr. Bundy, who said that he would have the review made of the paramilitary activity in Laos and the question as to whether the responsibility for the activity was properly assigned to the CIA. Meeting of December 9, 1961. During this meeting of the board, an opportunity was given to Mr. Gray to present some of the highlights of Mr. Gray's and Mr. Coyne's findings in the course of their on-the-scene review of U.S. foreign intelligence activities in 7 Middle East countries. One of the recommendations of Mr. Gray's report to the board, which the board subsequently adopted and submitted to the president, called for a review of NSC 5412 by 2 and related NSC intelligence directives to ensure that adequate guidance is given to ambassadors and CIA station chiefs with respect to covert actions generally, and that the station in Cyprus be reviewed with a view to placing increased emphasis on covert operations, particularly in the newspaper and trade unions fields, with appropriate support to be furnished by the CIA stations in Athens and Ankara. Subsequently, at the request of General Taylor, Mr. Gray and Mr. Coyne briefed the Special NSC 5412 by 2 group concerning covert action-related matters which had been reviewed during the Middle East trip. Meeting of January 19 to 20, 1962. In the course of this board meeting, discussions were had with the newly appointed DCI, Mr. John McCone. During a discussion of possible ways to reorganize and strengthen the CIA, the DCI said that he might decide to separate the functions of the DP area within the CIA. Mr. McCone thought that he might possibly name one assistant who would specialize in conventional covert operations, including the management of the clandestine services worldwide, and designate another assistant in the DDP area who would be in charge of such matters as COMET, ELENT, satellite reconnaissance, etc. Mr. McCone added that he thought he would pick a military man to head up covert operations and to handle paramilitary activities in order that these functions would be conducted on an absolutely professional basis, without disturbing the lines running from the DD/P to the CIA station chiefs. Further on in the discussion with the DCI, Mr. McCone expressed concern over the fact that in the CIA, organizational responsibility for financing was placed at a rather low level in the headquarters organizational setup, and therefore the DCI desired to place this responsibility upon a higher level official who would serve as controller in the office of the DCI. Mr. Gray asked whether this would increase problems with the Bureau of the Budget if the DCI made the controller responsible for all funding, including covert operations. And the DCI replied that in his opinion, he could compartmentalize the work of the controller in a way which would facilitate dealing with the Bureau of the Budget concerning covert action matters. Meeting of March 23 to 24, 1962. During a discussion in executive session, Board Chairman Killian noted that President Kennedy had accepted the board's recommendations concerning a redefinition of the role of the DCI and regarding reorganization of the CIA. Dr. Killian thought that the point had now been reached in the board's efforts when it should serve the president by examining selected areas of the government's intelligence effort, and he mentioned as an example covert actions carried out under NSC 5412 by 2. At another point in the board meeting, Chairman Killian again pointed out that there was a need for the board to explore thoroughly the activities being carried out in the NSC 5412 by 2 area. Dr. Killian thought that a general session with General Taylor at the next board meeting would give the board an opportunity to become acquainted with the present status of the specific programs being carried out under the special NSC 5412 by 2 group. The chairman thought that it would be advantageous if the DCI were present at such a board meeting, and Dr. Killian added that the board lacks clear information on covert action programs with respect to Cuba. Later on in the meeting, the chairman made several panel assignments to various board members. Dr. Langer was asked to obtain information concerning covert actions being carried out under auspices of the special NSC 5412 by 2 group in order that the board might be informed in depth with regard to such activities. The chairman said that Dr. Langer's report to the board should include information concerning covert actions with respect to Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, and Guatemala, among other countries. In another reference to covert action matters, during an executive session of this board meeting, Mr. Coyne suggested that consideration be given to having one or more of the board members take an on-the-scene look at covert operations which are being carried out abroad, particularly in South America. Dr. Killian agreed that this should be done. Meeting of May 11 to 12, 1962. During this meeting, Board Chairman Killian reported to the board concerning a talk he had had with Mr. McGeorge Bundy about the role of the President's Board. It was Mr. Bundy's view that the board must continue to keep itself fully informed about the foreign intelligence program, and Mr. Bundy emphasized the need for the board to be completely informed regarding covert action operations taking place in the NSC 5412 by 2 area. In an executive session, Mr. Coyne reported on a discussion which he had had with the newly appointed DCI, Mr. McCone, for the purpose of outlining the various board panel assignments and for the further purpose of scheduling CI briefings for the members of the various board panels. Mr. Coyne reported that the DCI's reaction was to indicate his belief that the board panel activities seemed to be concerned with matters which were appropriate for the DCI himself to pursue. Chairman Killian said that following this discussion between Mr. Coyne and the DCI, Dr. Killian had contacted the Deputy DCI, General Carter, to pursue the request that he furnish briefings to the various board panels. General Carter replied to Chairman Killian that the DCI wanted to hold up on such briefings, for example, the briefing of the board panel on NSC 5412 by 2 activities, because the reorganization process was still underway in CIA. Chairman Killian also reported that when he contacted General Carter a week later on this same subject, it appeared that the CIA was reluctant to furnish the desired briefings, but Chairman Killian took a firm stand in requesting them. During an executive session, Chairman Killian asked for suggestions concerning subject matters to be discussed with the DCI when that official joined the board meeting the following day. With respect to the Langer-Gray-Murphy panel, Dr. Langer said he had no particular questions to raise with the DCI concerning activities carried out under the NSC 5412 by 2 group. Dr. Langer observed that he was impressed by the way the special group checks up on the implementation of covert operations. Chairman Killian referred to various indications he had received that General Taylor was doing a very good job in this respect. Mr. Gray thought that if the board is going to try to protect the president in this particular area, the board must have a better flow of information to the board concerning NSC 5412 by 2 activities, in order that the board may make a necessary evaluation of the covert action programs involved. Chairman Killian agreed with a suggestion by Mr. Coyne that the board panel on NSC 5412 by 2 activities should remain in existence on a continuing basis in order that the board might be kept informed concerning these activities. Dr. Killian remarked to Dr. Langer that the board panel on NSC 5412 by 2 matters should conduct a continuing review with the objective of the panel becoming fully informed regarding covert action programs, following which the board would determine the next step to be taken. Meeting of June 25th to 26, 1962. In executive session, Chairman Killian informed board members that recently there had been scheduled a CIA briefing of the board panel on covert action programs. However, the day before the briefing was to have been given by CIA officials, Chairman Killian received a telephone call from the DCI, Mr. McCone, who said that he hesitated to provide the information requested by the board panel because only the president was privy to some of the covert operations involved. Mr. McCone told Chairman Killian that he had discussed this matter with the president, who had concurred in the DCI's suggestion that the briefing of the board panel be limited to procedural aspects of the special NSC 5412 by 2 group. Dr. Killian's reply to the DCI was to the effect that this would be a waste of time because the board was already fully informed concerning these procedural matters, and therefore the chairman expressed his intention to discuss this matter with the president, and the DCI indicated that he favored this course of action. Thereafter, Chairman Killian discussed the problem with Mr. McGeorge Bundy, who felt that under the board's directive it should have full information in order to carry out its duties. Continuing his report to the board, Dr. Killian said that on the preceding evening he had dined with the DCI, who on this occasion said that he was prepared to give the board whatever information it needs, including information on CIA operations in the covert action field. The chairman added that Mr. McCone planned to brief the panel himself from a book prepared for the first time in CIA with regard to all of the activities involved. Mr. Gray stated that the ability of the board to get complete information concerning covert action activities was essential if the board were to be able to discharge its responsibility to the president. Mr. Clifford thought that the gravity of this issue with the DCI was such that it warranted mention to the president when the board met with the president the following day, and the president should be told the background of the problem and how the matter had been resolved. At another point in the board meeting, there was a discussion of the need for identifying the president with clandestine intelligence and covert action activities. One board member suggested that in any event the public probably has an idea that the president is fully aware of covert actions undertaken by our government. However, Mr. Clifford pointed out that an attempt has always been made to maintain a separation of the president from intelligence agency operations all down the line in government, and this separation should be preserved. Chairman Killian observed to board members that when the DCI arrived at the board meeting later in the day, the matter of previously withholding information from the board concerning covert operations would not be brought up unless the DCI himself should bring it up for discussion. Dr. Killian added that steps should be taken by Mr. Coyne to contact the DCI and reschedule the CIA briefing of the board panel on covert actions, preferably within the next 2 weeks. When the DCI, Mr. McCone, joined the board meeting for a discussion of intelligence matters, at one point the DCI referred to his recent extensive field trip in South Vietnam. Mr. McCone said that training is being given to South Vietnam villagers in civil defense. Arms and training are being supplied to hamlet leaders who train and arm others, and there are plans for additional similar projects if the special NSC 5412 by 2 group approves. The DCI described the extent to which CIA is involved in the conception and administration of these programs, which are backed by U.S. military teams. He added that CIA trains mounted people as trail watchers to report on the infiltration of communist forces from North Vietnam, and CIA is installing communications between villagers and is equipping military units with communications. In the course of a discussion with the DCI concerning CIA budgetary matters, Mr. Gray observed that at times in the past the Budget Bureau had been prone to look into policy decisions which had been arrived at with respect to covert action programs in the special NSC 5412 by 2 group. Mr. McCone said that he anticipated no such problem in the Bureau of the Budget in the future, with the recent appointment of Mr. Robert Emery, formerly DD at CIA, to fill the Budget Bureau post which is concerned with CIA budgetary matters. In his further remarks to the board members at this meeting, Mr. McCone took up the subject of covert action programs, which he then proceeded to describe to the extent that they involved aerial reconnaissance missions over China following consideration and approval by the special NSC 5412 by 2 group. Later on in the meeting, the board was briefed by Mr. Helms of CIA concerning Cuba. Mr. Helms said that after the abortive Cuban invasion, there was a relaxation of covert action and intelligence collection efforts for several months with respect to Cuba. However, since December 1961, a major intelligence effort has been aimed at Cuba, involving U-2 overflights, interrogations of Cuban refugees in Florida, and the obtaining of intelligence reports. In answer to a question by a board member, Mr. Helms said that thought had been given to sabotaging petroleum which is en route to Cuban refineries, but such a covert action project was awaiting further policy consideration. General Taylor joined the board meeting at another point, in response to the chairman's invitation, and among other things he discussed the subject of covert action activities. General Taylor asked whether the board wished to indicate any reaction it might have to its current review of NSC 5412 by two matters, and Dr. Langer responded with a comment that as yet the board's discussions had not gone beyond a briefing on procedures given by the secretary of the special group. In answer to a question by Dr. Langer, it was General Taylor's opinion that the special NSC 5412 by 2 group is not set up nor equipped to run a continuing check on the implementation of all covert action projects, and for this reason the special group places dependence upon the PFIAB. When the board met with the president on the afternoon of June 26, 1962, Chairman Killian mentioned to President Kennedy, among other things, the problem of assuring appropriate political control of covert actions conducted by the CIA or other elements of the government. Chairman Killian observed that the special NSC 5412 by 2 group was functioning effectively. As a footnote to its report to the president, Chairman Killian informed President Kennedy that the board was happy to state that there had been resolved a problem which had recently arisen with respect to the board's need to know regarding certain intelligence and covert action programs. And Dr. Killian felt that with the resolution of this problem, the board could expect to receive the information which it had to have in order to carry out its responsibilities to the president. Dr. Killian added that based on briefings which had been received by the board, there appeared to be a lack of information on the overall plan with respect to covert actions regarding Cuba, which prompted General Taylor to explain that he had not yet had an opportunity to give the board a thorough fill-in concerning covert actions against Cuba, which had been considered in the special group. After the board meeting with the president, General Taylor summarized briefly for the board the intelligence programs being established with respect to Cuba, pointing out that such programs were the first phase of the effort against Cuba at this time. Meeting of September 28, 1962. During this meeting of the board, Mr. Murphy presented an oral report of the board's panel on covert actions operations, based on a detailed report which had been prepared by Mr. Coyne with respect to the recent meeting which the panel had had with the DCI. Mr. Murphy touched on some of the highlights of the information which had been supplied by the DCI and by Mr. Helms, and Mr. Murphy suggested that board members read the memorandum report which Mr. Coyne had prepared. Mr. Murphy thought that a good rapport had been established by the panel with the DCI, and he indicated that the panel would continue to review the subject periodically with Messrs. McCone and Helms. Dr. Baker, acting board chairman, emphasized the need for the board to obtain full and accurate information concerning covert operations being conducted with respect to Cuba and with respect to other matters. Meeting of November 9, 1962. At the beginning of this meeting, it was announced that Mr. Pace was absent on a trip to South America, in the course of which he would, on behalf of the board, look into some foreign intelligence and covert action activities in Argentina and Uruguay. Meeting of December 6 to 7, 1962. During this meeting, Mr. Coyne suggested that the board consider the advisability of a recommendation to the president that the board be granted continuing access to records of the special NSC 5412 by 2 group in order that the board's responsibilities to the president may be fulfilled. Chairman Killian said that he would see to it that this was accomplished in another way. Meeting of December 27 to 28, 1962. During this meeting of the PFIAB, and in the course of the discussions had with DCI McCone, the DCI made reference to the Mongoose program with respect to Cuba. He said that phase I of the program consisted of obtaining intelligence on the possibilities for organizing and supplying resistance groups within Cuba. The DCI said that it had not yet been considered an appropriate time for the execution of plans for violent actions of a sabotage nature within Cuba. Mr. McCone had thought that such actions would not be appropriate because of his own speculation in August 1962 that the U.S. would be faced with M-bombs. In any case, the DCI said, the Mongoose effort became diverted by considerations of Soviet activities in Cuba. For use in connection with the board meeting of January 25-26, 1963, primarily on the subject of Cuba, R.Ash prepared a memorandum for the file, dated January 11, 1963, summarizing the results of a review of minutes of the Special NSC 5412 by 2 group and of the Special Group Augmented, the latter group including the Attorney General, concerned with the Mongoose program directed at the Castro regime in Cuba. At the August 4, 1962 meeting of the Special Group Augmented, the Attorney General stated that the President felt that more priority should be given to mounting sabotage operations, and the Attorney General urged massive activity within the entire framework of the Mongoose program. Was agreed that one of the objectives of the Special Group Augmented, under the chairmanship of the Attorney General, would be to develop new and imaginative approaches to the possibility of getting rid of the Castro regime. The review of minutes of the Special NSC 5412 by 2 group with respect to Cuba reflected that this body was concerned primarily with reconnaissance overflight questions during the period leading up to the Soviet missile crisis. Meeting of March 8 to 9, 1963. In the course of this board meeting, the only consideration of any significance given to covert action matters was in connection with a visit of the DCI for a discussion of intelligence-related problems with members of the board. The DCI, Mr. McCone, mentioned that CIA had traditionally carried out activities in the paramilitary field. However, the Department of Defense now has special forces operating in the paramilitary field in South Vietnam and elsewhere, which has resulted in conflicts between the CIA and DoD elements in those areas. Meeting of April 23, 1963. At this meeting, in the course of a discussion of covert action matters, the question was raised as to whether the board should not ascertain specifically whether the President desired that the board go into covert action programs deeply, and if that proved to be the President's wish, then the board should take steps to ensure that it received full briefings from the agencies concerned. Chairman Killian stated that there were no limitations on the board's access to such information and that this is well established. At the request of Chairman Killian, Mr. Murphy briefly informed the board concerning the meeting which he and Mr. Gray and Mr. Coyne had recently with Mr. Court Meyer of CIA on the subject of covert action programs. Mr. Murphy said that the briefing covered operations in certain Latin American countries. The subject of Cuba was excluded because that was to be covered at today's board meeting, and the briefing consisted primarily of light touches and was of such routine nature that it seemed to downgrade the importance which the board attached to covert action operations and requirements. Mr. Coyne informed the board of a request from Mr. Kirkpatrick of CIA, who asked that the scheduled briefing of the board on clandestine operations with regard to Cuba be scheduled outside of the presence of Mr. Cottrell, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Bureau of Inter-American Affairs, who was scheduled to join the board meeting at the same time that the CIA briefing was to be given. Mr. Kirkpatrick explained that the DCI urged these briefings to be separate because the CIA briefing would include a discussion of covert action operations, which Mr. Cottrell was not privy to. Later in this board meeting, during discussions with the DCI, Mr. McCone was asked whether the terms of the U.S. Cuba prisoner exchange agreement were of a nature which would affect the conduct of present or future U.S. intelligence and covert operations with respect to Cuba. The DCI replied that Castro had not imposed any conditions which would preclude the U.S. from the conduct of such activities. The board was briefed by Mr. Desmond Fitzgerald of CIA. Mr. Fitzgerald said that the intelligence teams that CIA was sending into Cuba were primarily confined to intelligence gathering missions rather than covert action, although the teams would have missions involving low-key resistance and subtle sabotage. The CIA representative stated that monthly plans of the CIA for infiltrating these teams into Cuba were approved by the Special NSC 5412 by 2 group. Mr. Fitzgerald added that CIA was not receiving policy guidance with respect to positive covert action programs of a specific sabotage nature, and he indicated that a decision regarding this was being sought during the coming week. The board meeting was joined by Mr. Cottrell of the Department of State, who explained that he was serving as chairman of an interdepartmental coordinating committee established at the direction of the president to provide a focal point for coordinating policy recommendations and the execution of approved policies with respect to Cuba. Mr. Coyne raised the question, which had been brought up earlier by Mr. Fitzgerald, concerning the absence of policy guidance with respect to covert actions conducted by CIA. Mr. Cottrell said that with the release of prisoners in Cuba, in his opinion, the time had come for more aggressive sabotage operations with respect to Cuba. Meeting of June 25 to 26, 1963. A large part of this meeting was taken up with reports by various board panel chairmen concerning the status and adequacy of the implementation of recommendations which the board had made to date. As chairman of the panel on CIA, General Doolittle reported on those board recommendations concerning CIA which were being acted upon, and board Chairman Clifford asked that at the next board meeting General Doolittle identify areas in which CIA was not carrying out precedentially approved recommendations of the board. One of the CIA-related recommendations, which was presumably to be included in General Doolittle's next report, would be one in which the board recommended deeper cover for CIA's covert action operations. In the course of giving the report of his panel on CIA organization and related matters, Chairman Clifford included a reference to the board recommendation that the president be protected against identification with clandestine and covert action programs. Mr. Clifford said that the need for this was pretty well understood in appropriate quarters. At another point in the board meeting, when the DCI, Mr. McCone, was reporting to the board on CIA operations against Cuba, the DCI referred to certain covert actions. Among these were operations approved by the Special 5412 by 2 Group to promote disaffection in the Cuban military, hampering the Cuban economy, and sabotage. Meeting of September 12 to 13, 1963. This board meeting was attended by Mr. McGeorge Bundy, whom Chairman Clifford had invited for a discussion of several subject matters listed in the chairman's memorandum of invitation. As to the subject of covert actions, Mr. Bundy said in frankness that he did not know precisely how the board went about its coverage of NSC 5412 by 2 matters. He said that he looks to CIA from time to time for reports on the status of particular covert action programs, but preferred not to have in his office a current compilation of all of them. However, Mr. Bundy said that he was prepared to facilitate any review of covert action programs that a board panel might want to make. Meeting of November 21 to 22, 1963. During a report given at this board meeting by the DCI, Mr. McCone urged that the board urge President Kennedy to take actions, public statements, for example, to correct the bad public image which CIA was acquiring as the result of charges that CIA had engineered the anti-Diem coup in South Vietnam and was acting as a third government in that country. The DCI asserted that the CIA role in Vietnam was not to overthrow governments, but to carry out other tasks. Referring to paramilitary operations in Vietnam, the DCI said that there were problems involving the question as to whether CIA or Special Forces should have the responsibility for such activities. Mr. Colby of CIA later told the board that paramilitary matters in Vietnam were being transferred to U.S. Special Forces.
President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board meeting of the board November 9, 1962. Due to absence from the country, board members Langer and Pace will be unable to attend this meeting. The board convened in meeting at 9 a.m. on November 9, 1962, at the offices of the board in the Executive Office Building. Dr. Baker presided as acting chairman in the absence of Dr. Killian. Board members Gray, Doolittle, Murphy, and Clifford were present, as were Mr. Coyne and the writer. Messrs. Pace and Langer were out of the country at the time of this meeting. Illness prevented Dr. Land's attendance. Material for the board's use in considering the intelligence aspects of the Soviet missiles buildup in Cuba. Dr. Baker expressed the view that the materials which had been assembled are far too complicated for the board to consider in the course of only one day, and therefore the board would look to Mr. Coyne and Mr. Gray for selective reporting to the board concerning the highlights of the coverage which had been accomplished thus far in the board's review of the Cuba situation. Dr. Baker observed that the conflict involving Cuba is an intelligence conflict. The government does not know for sure the positions of anti-aircraft artillery units, which are protecting the SA-2 sites in Cuba. Furthermore, Intelligence 13 lacking on such elementary things as the support facilities which serve the SA-2 installations. Based on the intelligence which has been obtained, it appears that except for Moscow and Leningrad, the island of Cuba is now equipped with the best air defense system in the world. It is possible that Cuba is now on the verge of ensuring against invasion by reason of its possession of an assembly of the most dangerous armaments which have heretofore been collected in an area of that size. In the UN, the United States is discussing inspection and surveillance proposals and positions which in Dr. Baker's view are a century out of date. Dr. Baker said that he does not know how much the president is aware of these things. But there is a serious proposal being discussed which would contemplate 1 or 2 inspections a month, whereas we well know that within 72 hours, there can be made operational a most dangerous offensive capability. Mr. Murphy wondered what specifically had caused the decision to be made to transfer from CIA to sack the responsibility for reconnaissance of Cuba. Mr. Murphy thought that an understanding of the reasons for this shift of responsibility is important because the board itself seemed to have been oblivious to developments which were of such a nature as to warrant the stepped-up coverage by SAC. Mr. Gray's comment on this was to the effect that he had noted an uncertainty in the past with regard to whether the problem of Cuba had been removed from the board's area of responsibility. Mr. Gray recalled remarks by the chairman at a board meeting last summer indicating that the Cuba situation was being looked at elsewhere in government. Therefore, Mr. Gray thought that if in fact the board's responsibility extends to Cuba, this should be made clear for the benefit of the board. In Mr. Gray's opinion, if the board in fact had such a responsibility, then the board should have been addressing itself to the implications of public statements such as those being made by Senator Keating and others, and particularly the statement by Senator Keating on October 10, 1962, that ballistic missile installations were being constructed in Cuba. Acting Chairman Baker informed the board that he had confirmed with the chairman that the chairman's remarks at the last summer's board meeting were intended to convey that it was only in the NSC 5412/2 area that Cuba matters were being handled outside the purview of the board. Continuing, Mr. Gray said that it was a matter of personal regret to him that the public statements by Senators Keating, Humphrey, and others had not served to flag the situation. Mr. Coyne said that following that line of reasoning he himself could be said to have been at fault. Mr. Coyne went on to point out in this connection that Senator Keating and others were speaking from the benefit of executive branch briefings which they had received, including General Carter's briefing of the Republican Policy Committee. In any case, the senators had only information, which was in the possession of the executive branch. Insofar as this information was based on foreign intelligence acquisitions, Mr. Coyne pointed out that all of the U.S. foreign intelligence agencies are under instruction and have an obligation to furnish the board with all significant information derived from the foreign intelligence effort. And if such instructions and understandings were not in effect, the board would be in the position of having to dig out the intelligence information which the agencies are obligated to provide to the board on a systematic basis. In the case of the developing Cuban situation, however, Mr. Coyne pointed out that a top-level decision was made to give limited distribution of intelligence information on Cuba, and the board was excluded from those elements of the government which were designated to receive it. A periodic regional intelligence bulletin on Southeast Asia, and that consideration is being given to issuing similar regional intelligence bulletins for consumers in other areas. He described this particular recommendation as being a good suggestion. At this point, Mr. Clifford, reverting to the discussion on the Hanson-Baldwin matter, asked whether a separate investigative unit is being established as recommended by the board, in lieu of the referral of leaks for investigation by the FBI. Mr. McCone responded that this matter is still under considera. That in his own office he is prepared to set up such a unit, that he and the president feel this action must be taken, but that there is growing concern in some quarters that the creation of such a unit might ultimately lead to the establishment of some kind of internal Gestapo. Mr. McCone next turned to the subject of Cuba. He said that in late July there was first witnessed an increased tempo of Soviet bloc shipments to Cuba, and by August the rate of shipments had more than doubled. On August 10, 1962, there was held a meeting of principals, the president not participating, to discuss Cuban operations which had taken place during the preceding months of 1962. Up to that time, there had been an exploratory intelligence effort primarily aimed at providing a basis for deciding what covert actions could be taken against the Castro regime. The results of this intelligence effort had been reflected in reports appearing in the Central Intelligence Bulletin and in items which were set forth in the presidential checklist. At that time, Mr. McCone said, he analyzed the developments in Cuba as indicating 1. The establishment of a sophisticated silent operation to be directed against our space activities at Camp Canaveral. 2. The establishment of a comprehensive air defense system. Or 3. the introduction of a MRBM capability, or possibly all three. However, no one shared Mr. McCone's feeling that the Soviet activities in Cuba were directed toward the establishment of a ballistic missile capability. On the contrary, the Department of State and the Office of National Estimates within the CIA considered that such action by the Russians would be a departure from established Soviet policy. Mr. McCone said that throughout August a careful watch was maintained with respect to developments in Cuba, and in late August the construction of SAM sites was detected. By August 23rd, when Mr. McCone left the country on his honeymoon, there had been obtained photographic evidence of the construction of 7 SAM sites together with evidence of extreme security measures being taken with respect to the unloading of ships at Cuban ports. These developments, Mr. McCone related, gave rise to considerable worry on his part, and prior to his departure from the country, on August 23rd, he took the occasion on August 21, 22, and 23 to express his worry to the President and to the Secretary of Defense. Mr. McCone acknowledged that he had no positive evidence to support his concern, but he reasoned that the extensive air defense buildup which was underway in Cuba had as its immediate purpose the denial of the surveillance by the United States of the Soviet missile buildup in Cuba. The U-2 photography, which was being obtained, reflected that 26 SA-2 sites would be installed in Cuba. Mr. McCone observed that while the photography obtained at the time did not provide evidence of missile sites, a current review of that photography indicates the presence of tents and some construction equipment. Mr. McCone said that when he left the country on August 23rd, he instructed that a daily CIA bulletin be initiated at once with respect to Cuban developments, and he initiated issuance of this reporting after consultation with the USSR. When in September an incident was created by the U-2 which wandered over Soviet territory, and also when the U-2 was shot down over Communist China on September 8th. These incidents caused Mr. McCone to be concerned. Nevertheless, overflights were ordered. However, that from September 17th to September 20th, weather conditions would not permit the overflights of Cuba. At about that time, the special NSC 5412 by 2 group, as well as the CIA, became convinced that some risk was involved in the conduct of U-2 operations over Cuba. For that reason, Mr. McCone said, the flights which were scheduled were of a peripheral nature. 4 flights were authorized and flown in late September and in early October. But because of their peripheral or semi-peripheral character, they did not cover the western area of Cuba. Mr. McCone recalled that in early October there had been seen refugee reports concerning mysterious shipments being transported over Cuban roads, and there were other things of this nature reported by refugees. As reflected in the SNI dated September 19, 1962, Mr. McCone said that the USIB dismissed the possibility that MRBMs were being introduced into Cuba, and this view was based on the belief that such introduction would confront the USSR with so many difficulties that the action would not be undertaken. Mr. McCone said that he was in France when he received a summary of the SNI, and he disagreed with its conclusions because he could not see why the Soviets were establishing such a comprehensive air defense system in Cuba unless this was being done to shield the island against U.S. surveillance and to protect the conduct of some clandestine operation. Became greater. But even if this flight had been conducted, in Mr. McCone's opinion, there would not at that time have been obtained information of a more convincing nature than was later obtained as a result of the October 14th mission. Mr. McCone said that on September 7th, he made a recommendation that more frequent flights be conducted. And it continues to be Mr. McCone's view that there should have been more intense U-2 coverage during September. Mr. Clifford asked why, and from where was their concern over a possible U-2 incident involving Cuba. Mr. McCone said that this view was held within the NSC 5412 group, and in CIA as well. Mr. McCone said that he held a different view, but he was away at the time. He cited as a current example of concern attaching to the possibility of U-2 incidents the fact that today the special group considered a U-2 flight over the China-India border, and great concern was expressed in the group because the mission would have to include an overflight of Burma, and the prospect of the Burma overflight creating another U-2 incident was a matter of considerable sensitivity within the group. Mr. Clifford observed that while this concern might well be understandable in the case of Burma, he was nevertheless unable to understand why there should be a similar concern about reaction to a U-2 incident which might arise with respect to Cuba. Mr. McCone said that such concern with respect to Cuba does not exist today. And, as a matter of fact, on that very day, there were being conducted 10 low-level and 3 U-2 missions against Cuba. Mr. Clifford made the comment that he feared that the board might possibly be subjected to criticism in the light of the fact that there was no photographic reconnaissance over Cuba between September 5th and October 14th. Despite the DCI's own suspicions and the content of refugee reports with respect to a Soviet missile buildup in Cuba, Mr. Murphy inquired of Mr. McCone as to whether clandestine agents are being successfully operated in Cuba. Mr. McCone answered by saying that there have been 3 rather ineffective teams operating in Cuba with the principal objective of organizing dissidents against the Castro regime, rather than obtaining intelligence. He said that there are approximately 40 third country agents planted in various foreign embassies in Cuba, but we obtained no hard intelligence from them regarding the military buildup. Could be reintroduced into Cuba as below-deck cargoes. Mr. Clifford thought that it would be a good idea to continue our surveillance in order to ascertain the destination of these ships and the disposition made of the missiles. And Mr. McCone said that we can probably track the ships into the Black Sea and the Baltic, but that we would not be able to cover the unloading and transshipment of missiles into Soviet ports. Mr. Murphy wondered what had been the inspiration for the commitment not to invade Cuba. Mr. McCone supposed that this resulted from a Russian offer to do certain things in return for things which they asked for. Mr. Clifford asked whether it is possible for the United States to develop intelligence sources in Cuba which would relieve our dependence upon photographic intelligence. Mr. McCone said that this is difficult to do primarily because Castro had instituted a police state in Cuba and, as an example of this, Mr. McCone cited the practice of the Castro regime in following a procedure whereby in effect the ration cards of the Cuban people serve as identification cards. Mr. McCone said that previously 8 or 9 teams of trained agents had been introduced into Cuba since April. 3 of these teams remain in Cuba. The rest have been either killed or came back from their mission. Mr. McCone said that we have not been able to obtain much intelligence from these 3 teams because their principal activity has been to maintain their survival. Mr. Clifford said that he found it hard to understand why the United States has not been able to develop intelligence sources within Cuba, a country situated only 90 miles away from the United States, and one with which we have enjoyed. Mr. McCone said that the friendliest relations for 60 years. Approximately 2,000 Cubans are coming out of Cuba every week, and at that rate practically all of the responsible Cubans have left the island. Mr. McCone said after the Bay of Pigs invasion and intelligence paralysis set in for a time. Then, in December 1961, the President and the Attorney General and Mr. McCone had discussions leading to the instigation of some operations in Cuba. Mr. McCone said that he was aghast to learn at that time there were no refugee interrogations being conducted, and so the interrogation center was established at Opa-locka. He said that within CIA a 500-man task force was set up to work on the Cuba problem, and disappointing results have been obtained. Mr. McCone said that he is now concerned, and he has had under review the question as to whether too much dependence is being placed on refugees as sources of information, and consideration is being given as to whether it may be necessary to send U.S. citizens into Cuba as intelligence agents. He said that we are not getting Mr. Murphy intelligence on Cuba through conventional means. Observe that this is a salient point of interest to the board. Mr. McCone repeated his concern, which he had earlier expressed, that even with the Soviet missiles removed, the Castro regime will continue to be a center of insurgency for Latin America, as indicated by the fact that during the recent days of the Cuban crisis orders were issued from within Cuba for the initiation of insurgency action in other Latin American countries. At this point, Mr. McCone's visit with the board terminated and the board recessed for lunch. At 1:45 p.m., General Carroll, director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, joined the board meeting. General Carroll said that in an attempt to anticipate the specific matters in which the board might be interested, he had prepared some materials regarding the Cuban situation over the period from last summer up to October 14th and thereafter. He said that the extreme pressures which had prevailed and the requirement for daily presentations to top-level officials concerning the progress of the Cuban situation had made it impossible for him to complete a detailed survey up to this time, but that such a survey was in process within the DIA. General Carroll began by describing briefly the role of the DIA SIC, which was responsible for the coordination of intelligence regarding the Cuban situation. In July 1962, the SIC reported on the increased Soviet shipping into Cuba. In August, reports were disseminated with regard to increasing introduction of Soviet materials. On September 8, the SIC reported that the scope of the Soviet bloc assistance to Cuba suggested motives going beyond the lending of support and encouragement to the Castro regime. On August 15, in an effort to supply guidance and requirements for photographic reconnaissance, the DIA asked that the NPIC conduct a study and review of photographic intelligence which had previously been obtained with respect to 3 areas in Cuba: On August 17th, photographic evidence indicated that SA-2 equipment was located in 2 of the 3 areas, although there was no evidence of deployment as yet. The next photographic mission, flown on August 29th, disclosed the presence of 2 SA-2 sites and the presence of a 3rd site at Baines. Moreover, a study of the photographic evidence concerning the SA-2 sites.
President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board meeting of December 6, 1962 of the board's Cuban panel. Meeting of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board December 6 and 7, 1962. The board convened on December 6, 1962, at the call of the chairman, Dr. Killian, for a 2-day meeting at the board's offices, room 297, Executive Office Building. Beginning at 10 a.m., board members Murphy, Gray, Doolittle, and Baker reviewed materials and summary memoranda which had been assembled as the result of a study conducted by the board staff of information then available concerning intelligence aspects of the Soviet military buildup in Cuba. At 12:30 p.m., the board panel on Cuba, Messrs. Murphy, Gray, and Doolittle, and Messrs. Coyne and Ash, proceeded to CIA headquarters at Langley, Virginia. Purpose of the visit was to discuss with DCI and the members of the DCI's ad hoc committee that committee's interim findings which had been reached thus far in its study and preparation of a report on the actions taken by the U.S. intelligence community relating to the Soviet buildup in Cuba prior to October 1, 1962. Details of the board panel's discussion with the DCI et al. Are set forth in a separate memorandum in the board's files. At 6 p.m., Dr. Harold Brown, Director of Defense Research and Engineering, Department of Defense, joined the board meeting for a discussion of some aspects of advanced intelligence collection capabilities. Those present were Messrs. Killian, Murphy, Gray, Doolittle, Baker, Clifford, and Pace, and Messrs. Coyne and Ash. Dr. Killian informed Dr. Brown that the board had in mind discussing Project Oxcart with the president, and the board anticipated that the president would have to maintaining coverage of activities in Cuba. Dr. Killian next informed the board that he was somewhat troubled by the position of the board with respect to the following. 1. Mr. Bundy once told Dr. Killian that inasmuch as a special Cuban operation had been laid on with the Attorney General involved, the Mongoose Group would have particular jurisdiction with respect to Cuba. 2. During the height of the Cuba crisis, the board had not been included in the designated recipients of intelligence regarding strategic missiles in Cuba. And 3. It would appear essential that the board have an opportunity to examine the records of the special group. Mr. Gray pointed to an additional matter of concern to the board, namely, the view expressed by Dr. Charik that different interpretations had resulted from the analysis of satellite and U-2 photography of the same areas. Dr. Keelan agreed that this presents a most serious problem, because our government could induce to adopt an unwarranted attitude of disbelief regarding Soviet military capabilities in the same way that an attitude of disbelief was engendered with respect to the likelihood of the Soviet introduction of an offensive missile capability into Cuba. Mr. Gray, referring again to comments made to him by Dr. Charik, thought that Dr. Charik had identified 2 additional problems which would seem to be of concern to the board, namely, 1. The near shortage of photographic film which prevailed during the week of October 15, and 2. The fact that when U.3. intelligence operations detected the presence of C-band radar in Cuba, the U.S. was surprised by this and had no C-band jammers available except a laboratory model in the possession of a government contractor, despite the fact that we had discovered as early as 1961 that the Soviets possessed this radar capability. With respect to the latter point, Dr. Baker affirmed the seriousness of the problem, noting that our Ellen coverage had revealed that this radar capability was deployed in the USSR against our SAC forces, but nevertheless our B-52s still have not been equipped with the capability to jam this Soviet radar. Mr. Clifford expressed the view that the board has a peculiar and particular responsibility to the president in assessing intelligence aspects of the Cuba experience, particularly in the light of the earlier debacle at the Bay of Pigs, at which time the president stated privately that he could not make correct decisions without correct intelligence, and that he could not endure Cuba. Therefore, Mr. Clifford recalled, the president had established this board, and one of the reasons for doing so was to bring professionalism into the field of U.S. foreign intelligence. Now the possibility arises that valid refugee Mr. Clifford also feared reports on Soviet use of Cuban caves may be disregarded, that the administration may now have adopted the view that everything is all right, again now that the missiles and the bombers are out of Cuba. Mr. Clifford acknowledged that no policy advisory officials like to have a checkmate on the advice they give to the president, and this is understandable. But on the other hand, the president looks to the board to assess the intelligence aspects of the policy advisory function. Mr. Clifford believed that CIA had made errors in not conducting sufficient overflights, and top-level presidential advisors erred in not, and now that the Cuba crisis was proposing sufficient overflights of Cuba. Successfully met by the president, the feeling in responsible parts of government seems to be that things turned out all right, so why bother the president? Mr. Clifford said that he of course could not say what the president thinks about the U.S. intelligence job that was done regarding Cuba, but the president did say to the recent meeting of the Business Advisory Council that the DCI had been the only one who had called the shots on what was going on in Cuba. This prompted Mr. Clifford to observe that if the president thinks a good intelligence operation took place, this could have dangerous implications, and therefore the board should push on with its thorough review of the subject no matter what attitudes of resistance are encountered among the government agencies involved. Dr. Killian expressed complete agreement with these observations of Mr. Clifford. General Doolittle questioned whether the board was certain that the president was not informed of the views expressed by the DCI in the cables which he dispatched to CIA from France. Dr. Killian said he did not know the answer to this, but he was disturbed at the manner in which the DCI was making this case for himself. Mr. Murphy advised the board that he had been told by the DCI that General Carter had not informed the president about the cables received from the DCI. Dr. Killian thought that this question of whether the DCI had communicated with the president should be pursued with the DCI when he joined the board meeting today. General Doolittle added that it would be appropriate to ask whether General Carter had been instructed by the DCI to make the DCI's views known to the president. Mr. Clifford surmised that General Carter could have thought that the DCI would have returned if he considered his views urgent. Mr. Gray was of the opinion that it was in the area of CIA's deputy DCI/intelligence where the DCI's messages were ignored, and therefore it would be well for the board to talk to that deputy. Mr. Pace felt that the intelligence weaknesses apparent in the Cuba situation indicate the presence of broader weaknesses. He thought that in highlighting the weaknesses observed in the Cuba matter, the board would be in a position to make recommendations for broader improvements in the foreign intelligence effort. Dr. Langer cautioned the board to consider, however, that out of the thousands of refugee reports coming in, there were bound to be reports containing false and misleading information. Mr. Pace observed that if that line of thinking were pursued to its conclusion, the question would arise as to why we should have a refugee interrogation program. Mr. Pace was of the opinion, however, that the interrogation program offered an unprecedented opportunity to obtain information, and CIA should have made the most of it. Mr. Pace recalled that the board had received articulate briefings on Cuba from Mr. Klein of CIA, who also reportedly briefed Prime Minister Macmillan, the President and others, but Mr. Pace wondered on what firm intelligence basis these briefings had been conducted. Mr. Murphy noted that Mr. Coyne's study reflected that on August 14th, Mr. Klein had issued an order not to publish any information on missile bases unless it had been checked out with NPIC. Dr. Killian then suggested, and board members agreed, that an effort should be made to have a discussion with Mr. Klein during this meeting of the board. Secretary of Defense Dr. Killian expressed the view that the DCI, as coordinator of the overall U.S. intelligence effort, should certainly have the right to look at the budget of any element of the intelligence community, and Mr. McCone said he thought that he could work this out. The DCI went on to say that the total Department of Defense budget is $3 billion, whereas the CIA budget is around $400 million, and the defense budget is up over the previous $2 billion figure because the Secretary of Defense has added the cost of the reconnaissance program. Result is, Mr. McCone said, that the USIB is unable to look at this large budget, and therefore Mr. McCone is endeavoring to discuss it with Secretary McNamara. As for the CIA budget, Mr. McCone had thought that it could be kept at last year's level through reorganization steps and cutting down on wasteful expenditures, and at the same time an effort has been made to absorb salary increases within the existing budget. The DCI said that despite hard work on the CIA budget by all CIA elements, Then there had to be added on the cost of the Cuba operations, so the former budget of CIA is up to $425 million, exclusive of $146 million involved in Oxcart and NRO. The Bureau of the Budget cut this down to $381 million by charging the Cuba budget to the CI as contingency reserve over the opposition of the DCI, who feels that the reserve should be held intact for use in unforeseeable emergencies. Mr. McCone said he was not sure how all this would finally be resolved with the Bureau of the Budget. Turning to another subject, Mr. McCone explained the Mongoose project in answer to an inquiry from Mr. Clifford. The DCI said that this project developed out of a discussion last fall between himself, the President, and the Attorney General. The objective is to create dissensions in Cuba, which will lead to revolt against the Castro regime and to the unseating of Castro, leaving the Cubans to form a government of their own choosing. Some $26 million of the CIA budget is allocated to activities authorized by the Mongoose Committee, composed of the special group, plus the Attorney General and 2 or 3 other officials. Mongoose plans are developed under the coordination of General Lansdale, who work with state, defense, CIA, and USIA elements for this purpose. Mr. McCone said that the first phase of the project, the second phase was to involve sabotage, was an intelligence gathering effort, insurgency and other actions which were tentatively agreed upon at the Mongoose meeting of August 10th, but which then fell into limbo during the Cuban crisis until 2 days ago, when the Executive Committee of the NSC tentatively renewed consideration of the project. Mr. McCone said that he personally does not favor sabotage, or the DCI said he was guerrilla activity for a few months until the dust settles. Disturbed over the possibility of a new confrontation by the Soviets, who could take the stand that there had been compliance with U-3 demands for removal of offensive weapons and therefore any continuance of U-5 serial surveillance of Cuba will be, Dr. Langer suggested, counted by shoot-downs of our surveillance aircraft by SA-2s, that the SA-2 defenses might be for the purpose of meeting an anticipated invasion of Cuba by the U.S. But Mr. McCone thought not, pointing out that the SA-2s would be easy to knock out if an invasion should take place. Turning to the NRO, Mr. McCone said that the Defense Department/CIA agreement had not worked out too well because the director of NRO feels he should have fiscal control over Department of Defense as well as CIA resources. Through a review of this approach, Mr. McCone programs and the allocation of funds on a monthly basis, stated, puts accounting and fiscal responsibility into NRO 1E, into the Air Force, in effect. Mr. McCone said that he favors more CIA control because it is necessary for CIA money spent for NRO purposes have to be defended before special congressional committees in a special way. And since $150 million of this CIA money is tied up in NRO, Oxcart, the DCI feels he will have a hard time explaining how this money got.
President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board agenda for meetings of December 27 to 28, 1962. Board meeting of December 27 to 28, 1962. The board convened at 9 a.m. on December 27th. Those present were Dr. Killian, Chairman, board members Langer, Murphy, Gray, Doolittle, Pace and Clifford, and Messrs. Coyne and Ash. Dr. Killian suggested that board members read the draft report which had been furnished to the board on the preceding day by Mr. McCone, the Director of Central Intelligence, setting forth the results of the all-source review which the board had requested concerning U.S. intelligence community activities with respect to the Soviet military buildup in Cuba during the 6 months preceding October 22, 1962. The chairman asked that board members make note of any comments and questions they might wish to raise for discussion during this two-day meeting. Dr. Killian said that he was not sure the DCI's report had the approval of the intelligence community at this point, for he understood that Mr. McCone was at that moment reviewing the draft report in Seattle, and it was possible that some of the conclusions and factual details might not have yet received final approval by the agencies which contributed to the preparation of the report: CIA, DIA, State, and NSA. Accordingly, the chairman noted the importance of the discussions which the board would have on the following day with heads of the intelligence agencies. The chairman also thought that the board should aim for the preparation of a board report to the president at the close of this two-day meeting. Dr. Killian said that he had very recently talked to Mr. McGeorge Bundy, who hopes that the board will take the time it needs to produce a solid report on the handling given by U.S. intelligence agencies to the Soviet military buildup in Cuba. Mr. Bundy assured that the president will understand that the board is going into the subject deeply and objectively. About 10 days ago, the chairman related, He had received a telephone call from Mr. Bundy, who said that he had seen an early draft of the DCI's report from a confidential source and was concerned because the report did not get to the basic issues, and Mr. Bundy expressed an intention to talk to Mr. McCone about this. Dr. Killian stated that he had an appointment to see Mr. Bundy later in the morning, at which time he would ask Mr. Bundy to meet with the board during the course of this meeting. Board members Baker and Land were unable to attend. 24-day stay in Cuba, and our government is equally in the dark about Soviet and Cuban plans for further activities involving other countries in this hemisphere. Also, we are lacking intelligence on Cuba/Communist China discussions. Mr. Murphy reiterated his concern that our lack of information on such matters as these indicates the absence of an adequate intelligence capability to keep our government informed about developments in Cuba at the present time and in the future. Dr. Killian at this point reported to the board on the conversation which he had just had with Mr. Bundy. According to Mr. Bundy, the president is fully aware that the board is conducting its review of the Cuba situation. The president wants a group of citizens who have no axe and objective report from an axe to grind, and he is placing great store on this effort of the board. The chairman said that Mr. Bundy was obviously concerned about the prospect that the Congress will make inquiries into the Cuba matter. However, Mr. Bundy feels there is a bare possibility that congressional investigators will be more hesitant to raise hypothetical questions if they learn of the existence of a study having been made by a group such as the board. It is Mr. Bundy's hope that the board will carefully consider the preparation of a sanitized version of the report, but if the board and the president feel that this cannot be done, then the board should try to prepare a report which could be used in executive session of a committee of the Congress. Dr. Killian went on to report other matters which had been covered in his discussion with Mr. Bundy. He said that Mr. Bundy had expressed concern over the failure of the DCI to accept the suggestion that there be submitted a more adequate report than the one which the DCI forwarded to the board on December 26. Mr. Bundy noted in this connection that the DCI's report assigns to policymakers prime responsibility for any failures with respect to intelligence handling. On the question of availability of special group records for purposes of the board study, Mr. Bundy informed the chairman that certainly the board should examine such records and that they could be obtained from Mr. Parrot. Mr. Bundy commented that the board is the only group which can have this kind of access. As to the board's study, Mr. Bundy told Dr. Killian that the board should include in its review discussions with the Secretaries of State and Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mr. Bundy indicating that the Secretary of Defense has particular reservations about the DOT's report. Another matter mentioned by H.R. Bundy was his belief that the morale of the intelligence community as a whole stands to suffer in the absence of a carefully done review and report which is being expected from the board. With regard to the interim report which the board has underway, Mr. Bundy informed the chairman that the report could be delivered to him or it could be presented to the president directly, and Mr. Bundy thought it important that the board present it to the president in person. One other matter discussed was the board's concern about any intelligence letdown in the wake of the Cuba crisis, is being Mr. Bundy to belief that no such letdown is in prospect if present directives and discussions on the subject have any effect in government. As the conclusion of the chairman's cabinet of his discussion with Mr. Bundy, the board recessed for lunch. At 2:30 p.m., the board was briefed on the world situation by Thomas Lawler, Senior Intelligence Officer in CIA's Office of Current Intelligence. Mr. Ray Klein, Deputy DCI/Intelligence, was on vacation leave and not available to be present at this board meeting. Mr. Lawler explained that his own responsibilities included the handling of current intelligence matters, the selection and write-up of current intelligence items, e.g. in the CIB and in memorandum for the White House, and the preparation of internal intelligence notes for use at the CIA working level. Mr. Lawler pointed out that his duties were in the areas of analysis and production, not the collection of intelligence. His briefing the board included the following subject matters: USSR/CHICAM relations. Recriminations between the USSR and Communist China are the greatest in the history of their dispute, and an open break in party relations is most likely near. USSR/Cuba. The USSR is presently reappraising its foreign policy positions in the light of the Cuba crisis aftermath. USSR/Berlin. The USSR is at a diplomatic standstill in Berlin, and this is traceable to the USSR/CHICAM rift. The chairman asked the DOI whether the Mongoose activity presented any particular intelligence problem in the Cuba situation. Mr. McCone said that it had not. He said that in the Mongoose activity the special group and the Attorney General had given a great deal of consideration to the need for intelligence collection with respect to Cuba, but the intelligence needed was primarily for covert action rather than other purposes. Nevertheless, the Mongoose activity contributed to the overall intelligence collection effort on Cuba. H.R. McCone recalled that there was a hiatus in the collection of intelligence on Cuba after the Bay of Pigs invasion, and when he took office in November 1961, Mr. McCone was surprised to learn that no interrogation of Cuban refugees was taking place. Thereafter, following discussions with the President and the Attorney General, they got the refugee interrogations underway. Mr. Murphy wondered why there had been a letdown in intelligence gathering after the Bay of Pigs incident. McCone said that this took place before his time, but he assumed that the reasons had to do with discouragement and other psychological factors. In response to Dr. Killian's question as to whether another intelligence letdown was in store in the wake of the Cuba crisis, Mr. McCone said that there was in fact a great danger of such a development following what some officials consider was an intelligence victory for the United States. Mr. McCone, noting that the Soviet SA-2s remain in Cuba, said he had brought this up forcefully a week ago at an HSC Executive Committee meeting, and the president had agreed to get word to the USSR that any interference with our aerial reconnaissance of Cuba would be considered as being most grave, and Messrs. Mokloy and Stevenson have passed this word to Kuznetsov. Mr. McCone added that while low-level reconnaissance flights have been suspended, should any ominous development occur, it will be necessary to obtain presidential approval of the resumption of low-level flights. Mr. Pace inquired as to whether there were any prohibitions on the conduct of intelligence operations with regard to Cuba. Mr. McCone said yes, it is desired to follow a more aggressive pattern of agent infiltration into Cuba. He would like to see 3 or 4 month effort directed toward the obtaining of straight intelligence on Cuba, in lieu of political warfare, for example, to determine the trend of Soviet plans in Cuba. The DCI noted that the Soviets may quietly get out of Cuba, or they may in fact take 1 step back and 2 steps forward, and hold on to the Cuba real estate as a propaganda and insurgency base, as a means of keeping Castro under control, or in order to retain a capability for quick restoration of a Soviet offensive capability. The kind of concerted intelligence action which the DCI had in mind would include 1. Penetration of the Castro government regime, 2. The placement of additional agent teams in Cuba, 3. The continuation of efforts to obtain the assistance of British, French, and German representatives in Cuba, 4. The possible obtaining of useful intelligence from the attorney, Donovan, who is negotiating prisoner releases, and 5. Possibly the obtaining of useful information from the captain of the African pilot, who had a 3-hour talk with Castro and who yesterday asked to see a U.S. intelligence officer. Mr. Pace asked whether Mr. McCone would favor the use of Guantanamo Naval Base as a base for launching intelligence and related operations against Cuba. Mr. McCone said that he would not be in favor of this because if we were caught using Guantanamo for intelligence operations, Castro would obtain UI and other support for Cuba's demands for U.S. evacuation of the naval base. Answering General Doolittle's question, the DCI stated that U-2 overflights of Cuba were going at the rate of 2 a day, resulting in coverage of all targets once a week and in coverage of Mr. McCone said some important targets, e.g., harbors, more often. That Comer and USIB list the targets and that he then establishes flight schedules. Going back to the subject of Guantanamo, Mr. Pace asked whether the DCI had made a study of the expected intelligence return that would be obtained if intelligence operations were conducted from the base, Mr. Pace adding that he thought such a study should be made before a final policy decision was reached. Mr. McCone said that he had not made such a study. He added that in August the operators in CIA had proposed to the Mongoose group that Guantanamo base be so used, but this was opposed at the policy level. Mr. McCone said that he would not be opposed to a restudy of the proposal at this time. In answer to Dr. Killian's inquiry, Mr. McCone confirmed that we are conducting SIGINT operations at Guantanamo, and Mr. Kirkpatrick noted that NSA had only recently added 2 more positions there. Mr. Murphy asked the DCI to state the meaning of Mongoose B+. Mr. McCone explained that in the Mongoose group it was originally conceived that Phase 1 would be one of gathering intelligence on the possibilities for the organization and supply of resistance groups within Cuba, but this effort was only fairly successful because Castro has some 100,000 informers in place in Cuba and exercises internal security controls through a system of ration cards, and therefore, CIA did not get as many teams into Cuba as had been hoped. On August 10, Phase 2 was reached with Mongoose planning for A. Violent actions, B. A relatively high level of actions, or B+, and lessen actions, of B-. Mr. McCone said that he had not been prepared to endorse proposed B+ actions in the absence of plans for military backing, because of his own speculation that the U.S. would be faced with MRIMA in Cuba. In any case, the Mongoose effort became diverted by considerations or Soviet activities in Cuba, Mr. McCone stated. In answer to a question from Mr. Murphy as to who chairs the Mongoose group at this time, Mr. McCone said that he did not know whether B.R. Bundy or the Attorney General was now serving as chairman. With reference to the absence of photographic evidence of Soviet offensive missile deployment prior to October 14 photography, Mr. McCone said that if one looks at photography of Cuba obtained on by September 5 it is possible to spot evidence of activity at the Sub Cristobal HR site, but this activity could have been that of agricultural workers and the evidence did not then point to missile activity. Dr. Killian noted the board's concern that Soviet camouflage operations may be deceiving us. Mr. McCone expressed his own great concern that the Soviets are deceiving us by camouflage methods, acknowledging that our intelligence estimates leave a certain margin for error. Mr. McCone noted that at 15 nevertheless impossible for us to say that we know all that is going on in the USSR with respect to missile activity. In response to Dr. Killian's comment that public discussions seem to indicate that U.S. missile capabilities are superior to those of the USSR, the DCI considered that any such conclusion is erroneous and dangerous and could lead to a complacency which might well result in curtailment of the U.S. missile program by an economy-minded Congress. Mr. McCone added that in his presentations to select committees of the Congress, he always expresses reservations concerning U.S. missile superiority. Dr. Killian wondered whether the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Congress understand the danger of conclusions that nothing is there because it can't be seen. Mr. McCone said that undoubtedly there is a tendency toward heavy dependence upon photographic intelligence.